So Emily Dickinson lived from 1830 to 1886 and resided in the building known as the Homestead for most of that time. In 1963, the house was designated a National Historic Landmark, and in 65, it was sold to the trustees of Amherst College. The college used it for faculty housing. Dickinson Museum itself was formally established 20 years ago. Here to fill in these bare outlines and to talk about the Dickinson Museum's evolution is the museum's executive director, Miss Jane Wald. So please welcome Jane Wald.
Thank you. Thanks very much, George, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you today. George has indicated that I'm going to fill in some of the years where a little bit less is known about the homestead and about the Emily Dickinson Museum. And I'm going to, in a way, I'm going to kind of focus my talk and discussion on the period during which the Park family occupied the house between 1916 and 1965. And that's a time that's a little bit murky, a little bit misty in what we know about the homestead. So I'm going to try my best. So to begin with, let me start with just a few reminiscences about the Park family early in my tenure at the Emily Dickinson Museum. So I'm sure a number of you knew Priscilla Park, who retired to Amherst after a distinguished career as a neonatal nurse and a nurse supervisor. She was an active member of Grace Church, where her father was the rector early in the 20th century. I had the pleasure of attending some dinners in the tiny rooms of her small house on Amity Street. And I became acquainted with other members of her family when I first came to the Emily Dickinson Museum. When many of the Parks got together for family occasions in the 1990s and 2000s, they made an occasional but actually pretty reliable practice of packing into 2 or 3 cars and driving up from Springfield, where a couple of the brothers had retired. And they would pull into the driveway, unload, and roam around the homestead as if they'd arrived home, which of course they had. There might be as many as a dozen family members on these excursions. It was kind of a blessed chaos as we listened to their reminiscences, each member of the family overlapping another in the stories they told, and their urgency in sharing those stories with the younger Parks. And of course, our own interest at the museum in this kind of oral history. On these occasions, I had the privilege of talking with 3 of the 5 siblings who lived out their childhoods in the house in the 1910s and 20s. And I also remember one tremendously moving day when the last of that generation of Parks, the Reverend John Park, came back to the house of his childhood, where he occupied as his bedroom Emily Dickinson's room. He came back on his 100th birthday, and his son, Hervey, carried him upstairs to his boyhood bedroom so he could reminisce one last time about his childhood home. With this bit of a focus on the Park era, I'll talk about the conditions that made the homestead available for the Park family purchase in 1915. That is, what happened at the house and in popular culture after Emily's death. And then I'll talk a little bit about the Park's purchase, because there's some interesting things surrounding that period that I'd like to share. And what I can tell you about their experience of living in Emily Dickinson's house, some changes they made to the house and changes that they actually refrained from making to the house. And then finally, I'll take a look at the transition of the homestead from the Park family to a recognized literary site open to the public. And for some of this, at least, I have the almighty PowerPoint. So I hope that you're seeing a title page, Bewildered Buyers, the Park family at the Dickinson homestead, 1916 to 1965. Okay. At the time of her death in 1886, Emily was living in this big rambling mansion with only her sister Lavinia and their housekeeper, Margaret Marr. Next door at the Evergreens, Emily's brother Austin continued his vocation as treasurer of Amherst College, off and on moderator of Amherst Town Meeting, his involvement in utilities improvements and beautification projects throughout the town. Susan slowly emerged from illness and distress over the death of her younger son, Gilbert, and steeled herself to the relationship that Austin and Mabel Todd continued for another 9 years. Their daughter, Martha, went off to Miss Porter's school in Farmington, Connecticut, and their oldest son, Ned, considered and rejected the idea of employment outside of Amherst, resolving to remain as his mother's protector and buffer. And here is the Dickinson homestead as it looked right around that time. So there they were, Lavinia and Maggie, occupying the family homestead for the next 13 years after Emily's death, until Lavinia's own death in 1899. And Lavinia was always known for her quick and sharp tongue. She was the one who became the champion for seeing her sister's overwhelming poetic output into publication. She wanted to share the letter to the world that Emily herself had demurred to send. And as I'm sure you all know, during this period, Lavinia recruited Mabel Todd to prepare an edited collection of a few hundred of Emily's poems. Then it turned out to be the first of 3 collections prepared by Todd, along with a 2-volume edition of letters collected by Lavinia and Mabel from Emily's correspondence to provide some biographical context for the remarkable poetry gripping a new audience. So all these materials were published between 1890 and 1896, and then came to a halt 1 year later when Lavinia brought a lawsuit against the Todds, which they lost. And at that point, Mabel Todd's editing activities with Emily Dickinson's poetry went on a very long hiatus. As soon as Emily's poetry was released to the reading public, a number of critical reviews tried to find the merit of the poetry in Dickinson's eccentricities. So that is, in some ways, critics highlighted Dickinson's reported reclusiveness and sought her personality in the house that gradually took on the aura of a shrine. Mabel Todd herself led off with this effort in a column for Home magazine, attempting to excite interest in Dickinson's published poetry through what she called the intensely picturesque life of the poet and her place. And she wrote, "The fine old family mansion, built by her grandfather and still occupied by his descendants, offered with its beautiful grounds ample breathing space for a recluse." Then in journalism, several correspondents played up a similar tourism angle, placing descriptions of the Dickinson property within comments about Amherst as a destination. For example, Alice Ward Bailey reported to the Boston Journal that the Amherst of the tourist, the Amherst of picturesque drives, of romantic views and thrilling associations, was also the Amherst of the poet, of J.G. Holland and Helen Hunt and Emily Dickinson. Bailey, also the same journalist, also cast admirers of Dickinson's poetry as a cult of poet hunters, descending upon Amherst to unmask the conditions which produced and fostered so singular a genius. She She held that the village of Amherst was so distinctive and Dickinson such a child of Amherst that residents who had never seen her automatically understood the strange verses, as do none who have never lived there. And this was something she put in the Springfield Republican in 1891. And this went on with a bit of a bit of elaboration on that same idea when she wrote, "When people first began to come to Amherst summers, all they thought of was, oh, I'm sorry, this is a quote. She interviewed a hotel proprietor who shared this sentiment with her. When people first began to come to Amherst summers, all they thought of was excursions. Then came the folks who go crazy over antiques, tall clocks, spindle-legged tables and chairs, blue china, and so on." So for historical society members, this I'm sure is kind of appealing to you about all this, these antiques that that this person is commenting on as a feature of Amherst. Now you literary fellers are beginning to find out what an amount of your sort of stuff can be found here. And there are pilgrims coming to see where Miss Emily Dickinson lived. And that will be the next role Amherst will play. Well, she's equal to it. And again, this is 1891. This is just 5 years after Emily's death. A contributor to the Brooklyn Standard Union pictured the homestead's air of seclusion as particularly congenial to Dickinson's artistic temperament, in contrast to its relatively public location in a college town that was increasingly becoming a destination for visitors. So this contributor said it can easily be described so that no one can miss it. And he's talking about Emily Dickinson's house, pointing the way there. No other place resembles it, and this short description is enough to enable any stranger to find it. Now, that would make Emily happy, wouldn't it? The house is of old pattern. Trees and shrubs fill the grounds. A row of trees stands almost in the middle of the sidewalk in front. The house seems to shrink from public view. Finished with the comment that the old house is likely to stand for many years in its present condition. And future readers who wish to see the home of Emily Dickinson will doubtless find its essential traits unchanged for a long time. Well, the Emily Dickinson Museum thanks him for that comment. But there were other reviewers in the 1890s who tried and failed, perhaps, to strike the right balance between public interest and public responsibility to respect the privacy of the author. An unknown journalist said, "The passion of our time for personalities transmuted by a human interest in those who have taught or exhilarated us is no unworthy trait, but a seeking for the elusive secret of originality." Accordingly, we gazed with interest on a large yellow brick house standing somewhat close to the street, but screened from too curious scrutiny by stately old trees. Note the fact that this writer thought that people should hide behind the trees in order to get a good look at the house, so they didn't necessarily intrude. Let's see, I'm going to skip over this one because I wanted to get to just one more example of how of this transitional period between Emily's death, the emergence of her poetry in publication, and then what happened to the homestead. And perhaps another angle on this is that the process of, kind of formalizing a local cultural identity sometimes involved developing related organizations to embody various aspects of local heritage, including the Amherst Women's Club, for example, in 1893, the Amherst Historical Society, which met in the Amherst Women's Club originally, and the fact that these two organizations kind of had Mabel Todd at their center. So when we get past just past that period to Lavinia Dickinson's death in 1899, we get this suggestion that emerged in the Springfield Union in 1901. The old Dickinson mansion in Main Street, since the death of Miss Lavinia Dickinson, remains unoccupied, but it is a treasure house filled with memorials of her sister, Miss Emily Dickinson, the poetess, of her father, Edward Dickinson, and of her many distinguished ancestors. Would that some way might be devised whereby this famous mansion could be secured by the Amherst Historical Society. There you go. And its contents entrusted to its care for the purpose of perpetuating among coming generations the influence of the families of the 18th and 19th centuries. So my main point here really is that as early as the 1890s, the Dickinson homestead was already being painted as a legitimate site of pilgrimage and of tourism interest. Lavinia Dickinson, who lived until the end of that decade, must have experienced the unexpected callers, but she didn't, as far as I can tell, really call a whole lot of attention to it in her correspondence. She was just eager to get her sister's work published. But then in the first decade of the 20th century, some of that initial enthusiasm for Emily's poetry waned a bit, probably because there were no follow-up edited collections of her poetry published until the 19-teens. And perhaps that explains why the Park family failed to recognize what they were walking into when they purchased the house in 1916. So before I get too far ahead of myself, let me fill in a few details for the period between Lavinia's death and the Park's purchase. So because Edward Dickinson died intestate, kind of a bonehead move for an attorney, the homestead was inherited after his death by his children. And through dower, his widow, Emily Norcross Dickinson, and Austin's wife, Susan, held lifetime interest in the property. After Martha Dickinson, Austin and Susan's daughter, married Alexander Bianchi in 1902, Susan Dickinson sold the homestead to Bianchi, and he then sold it back to her in 1907. After Susan's death in 1913, the property was held in trust for Martha Dickinson Bianchi until she sold it to the Park family. From the turn of the century until the Park's purchase, the homestead was rented and continuously occupied by the family of Nelson Haskell, a local physician and surgeon who had been practicing in Amherst from at least 1887 and continued long into the 20th century. So what motivated Martha Dickinson Bianchi to sell the house in 1916? Well, this is a little unclear, but I think it had to do with the fact that her husband, Alexander Bianchi, had racked up a lot of debt in his financial dealings in the early business of the manufacture and sale of electric cars. So creditors were knocking at the door, and Martha needed to reduce the footprint of her assets. So sale of the homestead made sense. She'd already given away or auctioned some of the contents of the homestead, but not all. She moved her Aunt Emily's effects along with other significant family items to the Evergreens. But according to the Parks, she left trunks and trunks of other stuff in the attic at the homestead. Okay, so finally, we get to the Park era at the Dickinson homestead. So who were they and what brought them to Amherst? Hervey Cook Park was born in 1873 in Detroit, Michigan, the 9th of 12 children of Hervey Cook Park Sr. And the 12 children were from two marriages. Hervey was a child of the second marriage to Mary Park. So Hervey Sr. was a founder and president of Park Davis and Company, was well known still today, but once the world's largest pharmaceutical company. And here is an image of Harvey Park Sr. on the left, and four of his sons. Hervey is second from the right, looking down at a book or papers. So about this firm, it was in 1866 that a physician and pharmacist named Samuel Duffield formed a partnership with Hervey Sr., who was an entrepreneur looking for business opportunities, and then also with George Davis, who was a very skilled salesperson. Duffield withdrew, so the company was left to Park and Davis, and they incorporated it in 1875. Just a little aside about Hervey Cook Park Sr., he was a devoted churchman, and part of his legacy to his family really was a dedication to the Episcopal Church. Among his descendants were 3 priests, 2 missionaries, and a bishop. As for Hervey Park Jr., the Hervey Park who came to Amherst, he was educated at Lawrenceville Academy in New Jersey, then at Yale University for an undergraduate degree, and finally at General Theological Seminary for a Bachelor of Divinity degree in 1904 at the age of 31. So his appointments were a couple of years as a curate of Christ Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, then about 5 years as a priest at the Waynesville Mission in Asheville, North Carolina. And then he went up to be priest in charge at St. John's in Athol. So that's what brought him back to Massachusetts and really to the Amherst neighborhood. And from Athol, he became the rector of Grace Church from 1915 to 1923. I'll say a little bit more about what happened with this family after that period in a minute, but Hervey married Ethel Margaret Cushman in 1904, and they had 5 children. And these names may be familiar to some of you: Mary Allerton Park, Priscilla Park, another Hervey Cook Park, John Park, and the youngest David Park. So let's, I don't have too much to say about Ethel, except she really felt herself to be the hostess of the homestead. Once she found out that the Emily Pilgrims were coming to the homestead, not with invitation, but she welcomed them in and felt that she herself was the hostess of the house for those years. And this is kind of an unusual picture. This is a tinted, a hand-tinted photograph, presumably of Ethel Park in her garden, which is in the special collections at UMass. As I mentioned, when Hervey Park took up the rectorship of Grace Church in 1915, he began house hunting that same year. And according to his son, David Park, Hervey bought the homestead only because it was big and comfortable, not because it had anything at all to do with Emily Dickinson. As a first step, the Parks engaged the Boston architecture firm of Howe and Manning, one of the first architectural firms founded by women in the United States. Lois Lily Howe began her own firm in 1900. She partnered with another MIT alum, Eleanor Manning O'Connor, in 1913, creating the firm of Lois Lily, Howe, and Manning. And then when Mary Olney joined the firm in 1926, it became Howe, Manning, and Olney. So this firm specialized in domestic architecture, and their designs often mimicked Tudor, Georgian, and American colonial styles. And they kind of applied the American colonial revival style to the homestead. And when designing a project, they considered how the plan would affect the daily life of its inhabitants. And they just wanted to make things plain, simple, and comfortable. Um, they had a reputation for reusing materials from other projects in their renovations of a home to reduce costs rather than designing for new materials that would increase the cost to the owner. So for the homestead, their first task was to record existing conditions with photography and a set of floor plans prior to the execution of repairs and alterations. So I'm going to show you those photos and floor plans. And this has always been exciting to me because these are a critical resource for the Emily Dickinson's Museum's work in preserving, restoring, and maintaining the house. So this series of photographs, there's about 15 of them taken from different perspectives, all on the exterior of the house. And too bad none were of the interior. These are a little hard to see, but they are from across Main Street. And the one on the right is kind of an unusual picture because it's looking across the Dickinson Meadow, or what remained of it in 1916. And then looking from the east, that's from the Triangle Street side. This is what the house looked like as the Haskells still lived there. You can see their laundry out there on the clothesline behind the house. And another perspective from that same side. This is the north side. You can see on the left, there is no screen porch as there is today. That was a Park family addition. And that nice north entry door without the portico above it, that too was a Park family addition. Here are outbuildings, carriage house, barn, the front of the barn. So we can see the chicken yard there, sort of to the right in each of these photographs, and the hollyhocks growing in front of the barn, as we're told by other documentation about the house. So this is the floor plan drawn by this firm. So this layout is the layout from 1916. This has informed the Emily Dickinson Museum about what was in that rear addition back there: the shed, the washroom, the kitchen. On the second floor, Emily Dickinson's room at the lower left is always everywhere identified as Emily Dickinson's room. So there is no question about that. There is a hint in some of the correspondence at the Jones Library that the room just above Emily's was Austin Dickinson's room while he was waiting for his house to be built. So that leaves two other bedrooms where you flip a coin, in a sense. You don't, but one of them was Lavinia's room and one was the parents' room. So we think the one on the far right in that east wing addition was the parents' room, and the one directly across from Emily's room was Lavinia's. So these floor plans confirm what a contemporary of the Parks told us, that no change whatever had been made during the period of rental. So in fact, the Parks purchased the house as it was when Emily herself lived there. But with a young and growing family, Hervey and Ethel Park needed to update the house. Electricity and plumbing hadn't yet been installed. The only sources of running water were a cistern in the attic and a pump in the kitchen that drew water from a well right outside the kitchen door. Both the conservatory on the south side of the house and the large barn north of the house were in disrepair. So the decision to take down the barn was sealed when the young Park children were discovered launching themselves from the rickety hayloft. So in about 1922, an Amherst townsman, Reuben Pomeroy, was engaged to dismantle these two structures and to replace the barn with the garage that now stands behind the house. And evidently Pomeroy reused boards from the barn to build that garage shell and reuse the conservatory windows as the garage windows, which we several years ago recovered and used in the reconstruction of the conservatory on the south side of the homestead. So what other changes did the Parks, with the help of architect Lois Howe, introduce to make the house serviceable for their large family? For one thing, all the ceilings in the main block of the house were lowered to make room for new knob and tube wiring. And during our a restoration project some years ago, we found on one of the joists from which the 1916 wire lath was hung, we found the name of the carpenter and the June 24th, 1916 date of ceiling work. So this ceiling work was done by Carl Peterson and B.M. Smith. Here, I'll show you, this is a floor plan of the house during the Park period. So you can get a glimpse of a few of the changes that the Parks made. They put in new bathrooms, just one powder room right here on the first floor. So for a real trip to the bathroom, they put in 3 full bathrooms on the second floor and eventually one on a third floor. New level flooring was shimmed and placed on top of the original floorboards, and we are removing that 20th century flooring as we go along restoring the house to its 19th century condition. They put a concrete pad, a screen porch back here at the very end of the kitchen addition. And then they put in a 2-story porch here on the east side, taking down the 1-story porch that ran the length of that rear addition. They converted these east windows into full-length French doors. They built a brick patio out here to the east of the house. They removed the 19th century front door and converted this opening into a colonial revival entrance with side lights. They added this portico right up here to the entry to the main hall. At some unknown point, they converted the heating system from coal to steam radiators. But the most significant change here, first, before I show you the most significant change, I'll show you these bathrooms, 1, 2, 3, and 4 here on the second floor. But the most significant change was the creation of a 3rd floor within the cavity of the large attic. It housed a study for Reverend Park, a generous bedroom. Here's the study, generous bedroom and a full bath, and some closets for storage, but they left the west end as relatively unfinished space for storage. But less, it was suitable for storage, but less so for actual occupation. But even with these full-size rooms here on the 3rd floor, there was a good bit of attic space that remained between the living level and the cupola at the peak of the roof. The 3rd floor was accessed by a new staircase in the main hall of the 2nd floor, which we have now removed in this recent restoration. And we've put those attic stairs back behind a sort of closet door where they originally were located. The Parks, and this is the kind of the conservatory on the left in some disrepair, and some images of the barn where you see parts of it have already been taken down. So it was not in uh, terribly lovely condition either. They put in a tennis court down in the corner, the intersection of Triangle and Main Street. So you can just glimpse that tennis court fence right here on the left. And they changed the garden. Mrs. Park converted Emily Dickinson's garden into a half-acre of daffodils, thousands of which she delivered annually to shut-ins. She also downsized the Dickinson flower and vegetable gardens to a formal colonial layout, bordered by these boxwood hedges that you can see around the flower beds. Because the Park family occupied Emily Dickinson's own home, they had a unique experience of her growing fame. And as I touched on previously, these three collections of Dickinson's poetry, two-volume collection of letters, all published by 1896, and then the publishing went silent for nearly 20 years. And then in the mid-1910s, Dickinson's work got a bit of a revival. It was being appreciated more fully in academic circles. And this was kind of urged along by a Wellesley College professor named Martha Hale Shackford, who urged her readers in the Atlantic magazine to pay more attention to Emily's unique poetics. The same year that the Shackford article came out, Susan Dickinson died, and her daughter Martha began to form a plan to publish a new edition of selected poems called The Single Hound, that she dedicated to, quote, those dear dead women, Emily and Susan. So this came out in 1915, the year that the Parks purchased the homestead. So it's hard to know just how this temporary publishing hiatus and its resurgence, just as the Park family occupied the house, might have sort of freshened that flow of pilgrims to the homestead. In any case, the Parks took it all in with grace and humor. David Park, who was the youngest of Hervey and Ethel's children, remembered that, quote, his mother's usual procedure was to invite callers into our library, sit them down, get out a book on Emily, and read them a passage or two before drafting one of us children to conduct a tour of the house. Nobody but the family knew that she couldn't read without her glasses, that she often couldn't find her glasses when unexpected Emilyites arrived, and that the reading was from memory. More formal visitors, other than these who just dropped in, were never charged for the privilege of wandering through Emily's house, even when the tour included a walk up the block to West Cemetery. The one exception was when his sister Mary Allerton Park was a missionary in China, and father suggested that a donation for China relief would be welcome, and most people gave generously. Well, in 1924, Hervey Park was suffering from a serious respiratory condition. I think it was tuberculosis. So he resigned his position at Grace Church and moved the family to California for its better climate. And there he became vicar of the Church of the Angels in Pasadena. So during this time, the family rented the homestead to tenants most years from fall through spring, but always returned to the homestead for the full summer every year until 1935, when Reverend Park retired and moved back to Amherst permanently. So these visits that David Park was describing, may have been before their move to California, as well as during the summers when they were back at home. Well, a significant event in 1938 changed the character of the property, not necessarily permanently, but it still hasn't recovered. And you've probably guessed that I'm talking about the hurricane of 1938. The grounds had always been a point of pride, both for the Dickinsons and for the Parks. But this hurricane seems to have vented particular vengeance on the Homestead and Evergreen's properties. And the newspaper reported that there were a great many trees on these two properties, many of them old and of great height. The mansion, so-called, the brick house known as the Emily Dickinson Place and now occupied by Reverend Hervey Park, was built in 1813, and a considerable number of the trees on the place were already growing at that time. This is attested to by historical and personal writings. The hedge in front of the Madame Bianchi house is 70 years old. In all, there are between 60 and 70 trees felled on that property and 34 on the Park Place. The tall pines which surrounded the latter place, and to which Emily Dickinson addressed some of her best known poems, are down, as is the row of huge pines which led from one home to the other, to a tree. 4 black walnuts, a rarity in this section, went down, as well as oaks, maples, spruces, pines, elms, 1 grand old tulip tree, and some hickory. These properties probably lost more of value than any other one private holding. So I recall also an anecdote that Hervey, Hervey the third, I guess it was, the Hervey who was the child of Hervey Jr. and Ethel, that he told about this hurricane of 1938 when the family realized that the hurricane was really doing real injury, real damage to the trees on the property. And that great old white oak that stands just east of the homestead had been whipped by the wind and pulled up, the roots pulled out, so that the ground was so soggy that the tree was leaning over, all, at a maybe 70-degree angle. So Hervey and a son or a brother went out there with ropes and lassoed the tree to pull it upright and stake it in the ground so it could reestablish itself. And that's why we still have that magnificent tree spreading over the east lawn. So we're getting now to kind of toward the end of the park period. There's this period between roughly 1940 and the time the house was sold in 1965, where, to tell the truth, I don't know a whole lot of what happened there, except that the Park family continued to use the house as its residence until Ethel Park became really too old to maintain the house and too old, she felt, to be hostess to visitors as she had been. So their son, David Park, was looking at putting the house up for sale. The one stipulation that Ethel Park made on this, and that I think David honored, was that it was to be maintained in a manner fitting to the memory of Emily, and that it be open to visitors. So in response to this, there was a band of University of Massachusetts professors who put out the cry that the University of Massachusetts should buy the house and maintain it as a historic site. And then that ended up in the newspaper. The response from Amherst College was, well, we're interested in it too, but the faculty here just probably assumed we were interested in it. So there was this bit of back and forth. Simultaneously, the homestead was made a National Historic Landmark, along with a number of other literary sites around the country. But in the end, it was Amherst College that purchased the house They had several options in mind for how it should be used, but settled on it as a place for faculty from a related field to live, and that it be offered up as with being open to visitors, which it was for 2 hours on Tuesday afternoons by appointment at first, then gradually expanding until the present day when it is open in the summer 6 days a week, all day. So that's a quick run through. I probably ran through the last portion of this a little more rapidly than I'd necessarily intended, but I have an interesting anecdote in my back pocket if you if that is one of the questions that comes forward. But for now, I'll ask if there are any questions.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, did the residents continue to offer hospitality if people just showed up when it wasn't Tuesday afternoon?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I know of some stories. There's one. The first faculty member who lived here was Lewis Mudge, who was chaplain at Amherst College, and his spouse Jean Mudge was the first curator of the Dickinson homestead. And there were times when people would just arrive. Mm-hmm. There was one occasion when Jean had a sense there was someone in the house and went over to Emily Dickinson's room, and there found a woman in go-go boots and a miniskirt, and asked what she was doing there. And that person turned out to be Julie Harris. So she did show Julie Harris around, I think. Wendy Collard probably knows this story better than I do. But yes, there were times when people just came, kind of as they always had and still do, when the place is not open.
I have a question. When you talk about restoring the house, do you have a specific year or date you are trying to restore to?
Yes, our goal is to restore it to the period when Emily Dickinson was writing poetry in the house. So nearly all the poems that have come down to us were, nearly all of them probably were written here at the homestead. So it's this 1855 period when her father, Edward, purchased the house from the Mack family who'd lived there for 15 years. And he made extensive renovations. The renovations he made are those reflected in those 1916 floor plans. So that's Emily's adult writing years. That's our goal.
We have a question in the chat of, are the stairs to the cupola now as Emily knew them? Are they accessible to visitors? And what happened to the trunks in the attic?
Yes, the stairs to the cupola are as Emily knew them. There is a small set of winding stairs that was partially constructed from boards recovered that were board walls that were kind of temporary walls in some spaces in the homestead that were removed in 1855, but they didn't throw out the lumber. They reused the lumber in building the stairs to the cupola and a new back staircase in the homestead. The trunks in the attic, so the Parks, they told Martha Dickinson Bianchi that she needed to get her stuff out of the attic. So they moved the trunks over to the carriage house that then stood beside the evergreens. And she stored them there for a little while and then kind of went through them and moved things into the house.
Hi, Jane. I'm wondering if there is any sort of correspondence that exists between Maddie Dickinson Bianchi and the Parks.
Yeah, there is, and that is at Brown University. I've seen some of it, and that is the source of my back pocket anecdote. But yes, there's correspondence between them. I think probably a fair amount, because the Parks. Martha, from time to time, she kind of split her residence between National Arts Club in New York City and the Evergreens. And meanwhile, the Parks were back and forth from California. So they kind of, in a sense, kind of spotted each other when they were in town. And so this story I ran across because I was looking for information about the path between the two houses that Emily refers to as the path just wide enough for two who love. And I came across a series of correspondence between Hervey Park and Martha Dickinson Bianchi, where they had always been cordial neighbors, but then they got into a little tiff about Hervey Park moving a gate post at the end of the driveway, because at that point the Parks were, they were needing to swing their long automobiles around the corner from Main Street into the driveway, and the gate post was a bit of an impediment. The gate post stood on the Parks property. However, in a bit of an eccentric deed from Martha to the Parks of the property, she had set the boundary line between the two houses as running on a kind of a jagged line behind the garage down toward the end of the driveway that ran from tree to tree, because she wanted the trees that her father planted to remain under her control. So that went on down to Main Street. That gate post was on the Parks property, but she had mentioned it, she had enumerated it specifically in the deed as something that would remain. So apparently Hervey Park had some conversation with her in which he thought she had approved his moving the gate post. And Martha didn't have the same memory. So while Martha was down at the National Arts Club in New York, Hervey Park began to have this work done. And a neighbor tattled on him. So he wrote a letter to Martha in New York saying, "Oh, I saw this happening at night, and Hervey was standing around looking kind of sheepish, or it was sort of the implication that something underhanded was going on." So they corresponded back and forth, and each tried to set out their case. Hervey ended up drawing a map, a plot plan, which I will share just because it's kind of interesting. There it is, where he pinpoints all these little marks where here's a pipe, here's a tree, here's a hemlock that's identified on this plan, and it goes on down to the right toward Main Street. But of real interest right here is he's drawn in the path, and he's labeled it path wide enough for two who love each other. And then he's got it all measured out, I think in feet, with measurements of the distance between each of these pins. So that's been a real of great value to us. And it's, in a way, it's kind of a sad ending that, that all of these years of neighborly tolerance and cordiality should end on that note, because Martha died just a few weeks after their last bit of correspondence. That's a long answer, but yeah, go visit Brown University. Hey, Sherry.
Jane, you had reminiscences from David Park, and you mentioned that you had been visiting Priscilla Park. Do you have any reminiscences of the homestead from Priscilla Park?
I don't have any very clear ones. What I do recall is that, Priscilla was a guide. After she retired here to Amherst, she was a guide for quite some time. She claimed that she did not like poetry very much. That's the main thing I remember about Priscilla.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? I had one more question. If you could talk at all, how has the museum's vision changed in the last 20 years when it was founded? How do you see your role in the community having changed?
So I would say in the last 20 years, I think initially, kind of at the outset of that period, we put a lot of focus and emphasis on kind of setting up the houses for, or setting them up for eventual restoration. So there was a whole lot of infrastructure improvements we needed to do to stabilize, to secure the structures, and to prepare them for for preservation and restoration that would more adequately, more fully evoke Emily Dickinson's own time here. And at the same time, made great efforts to expand access in terms of, schedule, how many people could come see and experience Emily Dickinson's own home. The Evergreens itself was its own challenge, so that took a little bit of attention also. Then, not quite 10 years ago, we began to develop a concept for an expanded vision for the Emily Dickinson Museum that would develop aspects of programming that we could undertake for this community and for the Dickinson and poetry community at large, that could be more generative, more creative, more artistic, to kind of balance the emphasis on functioning as a literary site, historic house museum, with kind of a larger idea of what creativity, imagination, and poetry, what that can be in our lives, and how that can be relevant and meaningful in the many kinds of challenges that we face as individuals and as a society. So that is more the direction, this kind of, I almost want to call it sort of a two-pronged approach, except we want it to be entirely integrated with the other. So that's, I would say that's how that is our trajectory at this point. Now,
Well, I was going to ask about the Bianchi house. I got to Amherst in 1970, and when I kind of became aware that there was this, pair of houses there, I was under the impression that it was empty a large number of years, but that may have been wrong. I don't know.
the last person who owned and occupied the house was Mary Hampson, who was a personal friend of Martha Dickinson Bianchi, and she married Alfred, who was Martha's kind of literary assistant. And Mary Hampson lived until 1988. So the house was private residence until 1988, and it was her, she and her attorney sort of created this plan that the evergreens would not be sold, but should be developed as a kind of cultural facility, she called it, in honor of what she said, that great American author, Martha Dickinson Bianchi. So it was taken by the Martha Dickinson Bianchi Trust was formed to take on this task of developing it as a cultural facility, but it was still full, absolutely chock full of both of the belongings of Dickinson's from the homestead, belongings from Austin and Susan Dickinson's time, Martha, and the Hampsons. So it was, probably 2 houses worth of contents. And that is the bulk of the Emily Dickinson Museum's collection now, which is finally being cataloged. The entire collection now being cataloged for the very first time.
And kind of 1920s kitchen, et cetera, if I recall correctly from my first visit there. Yeah. If that, maybe not even quite 1920. I don't know. Pretty early.
Yeah. Well, the first time, maybe you had this experience too, but the first time I went into that kitchen, I saw it was like a 1904 cast iron range. And right next to it was a 1950s, maybe, electric range. And then right next
Wasn't there a pump also in there?
There was a cistern that was removed by the time I saw it. But then on a shelf next to the electric range was a microwave. So all of these periods mixed up together.
Yeah.
Do people have other questions? I'm not seeing any. So perhaps that'll do it for this morning, this noon time. Thank you very much for giving us the, more of the depth background of a well-known Amherst landmark. Thank you very much.
Thanks all. Very welcome. Good to see you, and I hope you have a good afternoon.